To understand the Mesozoic Era, you first have to forget almost everything you know about the world today. Forget the 7 continents you learned in school. Forget the oceans, where they currently sit. Forget the familiar shapes of coastlines and mountain ranges. The Earth you are about to explore looked nothing like the one you live on. And yet, it was the same planet, spinning in the same place, orbiting the same sun. It was just a completely different version of home. The Mesozoic Era lasted from roughly 252 million years ago to about 66 million years ago. That is a stretch of time so vast it is almost impossible to hold in your mind. If you compressed all of Earth's history into a single 24-hour day, humans would not appear until the very last second before midnight. The Mesozoic, by contrast, covers several full hours of that day. It is not a footnote in Earth's story. It is one of its longest and most dramatic chapters. The era is divided into 3 periods. First came the Triassic, which ran from about 252 to 201 million years ago. Then the Jurassic, from 201 to 145 million years ago. And finally, the Cretaceous, from 145 million years ago, all the way to that catastrophic end, 66 million years in the past. Each of these periods had its own character, its own climate, its own cast of creatures. Together, they form a story of life rebuilding itself after disaster, exploding into spectacular diversity, and then being brought low by disaster once again. But before the Mesozoic could begin, something had to end. And what ended was terrible and thorough. Around 252 million years ago, at the boundary between the Permian period and the Triassic, Earth experienced the worst mass extinction in its history. Scientists call it the Great Dying. It was not a quick event. It unfolded over a period of tens of thousands of years, though, in geological terms, that is still shockingly fast. Massive volcanic eruptions in what is now Siberia pumped enormous quantities of carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere. The oceans acidified. Global temperatures spiked. Oxygen levels in the seas plummeted. Somewhere between 90 and 96% of all marine species went extinct. On land, perhaps 70% of vertebrate species disappeared. The world was scraped nearly clean. What survived was a rump of life clinging to whatever corners of the planet were still livable. And it was from those survivors that the Mesozoic world would be built. The stage had been cleared. The drama that followed would be one of the most extraordinary in the history of life on Earth, and it all started on a planet that looked, from above, almost nothing like ours. The very beginning of the Mesozoic. All of Earth's land masses were still joined together into a single, enormous supercontinent called Pangaea. Picture a jigsaw puzzle with all the pieces pushed together into one big shape. That was the world. There was one giant land, and around it stretched a single enormous ocean called Panthalassa. The interior of Pangaea was remote and dry in a way that is hard to imagine. Rain could barely reach the deep center of the continent. Deserts spread across vast swaths of the interior. The climate was extreme, with scorching summers and bitter winters in the continental heart. Life clustered near the coasts and along river systems where water was available. The atmosphere of early Triassic Earth was also quite different from what we breathe today. Oxygen levels were lower. Carbon dioxide concentrations were higher, which meant a stronger greenhouse effect and a warmer world overall. There were no polar ice caps to speak of. The poles were cold by the standards of the tropics, but they were not frozen year-round the way they are today. This was a world without permanent ice, a world of warmth from equator to pole, a world where the thermostat had been turned up and left there. The seas that bordered Pangaea were a mix of the familiar and the deeply alien. A great bay called the Tethys Sea cut into the eastern side of the supercontinent, forming a warm, shallow body of water that would prove tremendously productive for marine life. It was in these warm shallows that the oceans slowly began to recover from the devastation of the Great Dying. New forms of coral began to build reefs. Fish diversified. The first marine reptiles slipped back into the water, finding an ocean rich with opportunity now that so many competitors had disappeared. On land, the recovery was slower and stranger. The survivors of the Great Dying included some animals that looked almost familiar and others that were deeply odd. Creatures called Dicynodonts, squat, barrel-bodied plant eaters that looked a bit like tusked tortoises crossed with pigs, roamed in large numbers for a time. Small reptiles scurried through the undergrowth. A group of animals called the Archosaurs, the ancestors of both crocodilians and dinosaurs, began to diversify and spread. Everything was competing for a world that had been emptied, and the opportunities were enormous for those fast and adaptable enough to take them. This is where the Mesozoic story truly begins. Not with the thunder of great dinosaurs shaking the ground, but with a world in recovery, a world of survivors feeling their way forward, a world where every niche was open, every role available, every corner of the landscape an invitation. The great stage was set, the curtain was about to rise, and the creatures that would dominate this world for the next 186 million years were just beginning to find their feet. The Triassic period is the least celebrated of the three Mesozoic periods. When people think of dinosaurs and ancient life, they tend to jump straight to the enormous sauropods of the Jurassic or the fearsome predators of the Cretaceous. But the Triassic is where it all began. It is the origin story. And like many origin stories, it was complicated, unpredictable, and full of creatures that history has largely forgotten. In the early Triassic, the world was dominated not by dinosaurs, but by a different group of Archosaurs entirely. It's the ones that would eventually give rise to crocodilians. These were the ruling reptiles of their day, and they came in a remarkable range of shapes and sizes. Some were heavily armored, some were surprisingly fast, some walked on four legs, others could rear up on two. They occupied almost every ecological role on land, from small insectivores to large top predators. For much of the Triassic, they were the kings of the earth. Dinosaurs did not simply appear and take over. They emerged gradually, beginning around 230 to 240 million years ago. And for millions of years, they were a relatively minor part of the ecosystem. The earliest dinosaurs were small, bipedal animals, quick on their feet, probably warm-blooded or close to it, and extremely adaptable. They lived alongside many other types of animals and were not immediately dominant. What they had was potential. In time, and eventually, another catastrophe would give them their chance. But before that catastrophe, the Triassic world had its own remarkable cast of characters. In the skies, and yes, there were skies over the Triassic worth looking up at, the first pterosaurs appeared. These were the first vertebrates ever to achieve powered flight. They were not dinosaurs, though they were closely related. Their wings were formed from a membrane of skin stretched along an enormously elongated fourth finger. Early pterosaurs were relatively small, but they were true flyers, and their appearance marked a turning point in the history of life. The air, previously the domain of insects alone, now had larger inhabitants. In the oceans, the recovery from the Great Dying was producing some spectacular new forms of life. The ichthyosaurs, marine reptiles, shaped rather like dolphins, were among the most successful ocean creatures of the Triassic. They had evolved streamlined bodies, large eyes, and powerful tails that propelled them through the water at speed. Some grew to enormous sizes. They were not fish, and they were not dinosaurs. They were reptiles that had returned to the sea, and they would remain a major force in the world's oceans for over 100 million years. The gnathosaurs and placodonts occupied the shallower coastal waters. Gnathosaurs were long-necked, long-tailed reptiles that probably spent time both in the water and on land, like enormous prehistoric seals or otters. Placodonts were stranger still, broad, flat-bodied creatures with crushing teeth adapted for breaking open shellfish. Some later placodonts evolved heavy, shell-like armor on their backs, giving them an uncanny resemblance to large sea turtles. Though the two groups were not closely related, evolution, when faced with similar problems, tends to find similar solutions. The vegetation of the Triassic world was very different from anything alive today. There were no flowering plants. Flowers had not yet been invented. The landscape was dominated by conifers, cycads, ferns, horsetails, and seed ferns, ancient plant groups that looked primitive by modern standards, but were enormously successful at the time. The great conifer forests of the Triassic would have felt familiar in a vague way. Trees reaching upward, casting shade, dropping cones, but the details would have been strange. No birdsong, no buzz of bees, no scent of flowers on the breeze. Just the wind in ancient leaves, the creak of old wood, and the sounds of creatures you would not recognize. The supercontinent of Pangaea was still largely intact during the Triassic, though it had begun to show its first signs of pulling apart. Rift valleys had started to form, places where the crust was stretching and thinning. Volcanoes were becoming active along these rifts. The process was slow by any human reckoning. It would take millions more years for the continents to separate into recognizable shapes, but it was underway. The engine of plate tectonics, which had assembled Pangaea in the first place, was now beginning to dismantle it. Then, at the end of the Triassic, around 201 million years ago, another mass extinction struck. It was not as severe as the Great Dying, but it was still deeply significant. Massive volcanic eruptions associated with the opening of the central Atlantic Ocean released enormous quantities of carbon dioxide. Temperatures spiked again. Many of the dominant Archosaurs, the crocodilian-lined reptiles that had ruled the land for so long, died out. The Dicynodonts, which had survived the Great Dying and hung on through the Triassic, finally disappeared. Large numbers of marine species went extinct once more, but the dinosaurs survived, and in the emptied world that followed, they finally had their moment. The stage was cleared for the second time in Earth's history, and this time, the creatures that would fill it would be truly extraordinary. The Jurassic Period was about to begin, and with it, the Age of Giants. If there is one image that defines the Mesozoic in the public imagination, it is probably the Jurassic. Enormous sauropod dinosaurs with impossibly long necks reaching into the treetops. Giant predators stalking through open forests. The world rendered in shades of green and brown, dense with life, thundering with footsteps. This image is not entirely wrong, though it leaves out a great deal. The Jurassic was extraordinary, but it was also far more complex, far stranger, and far more interesting than the popular picture suggests. The first thing to understand about the Jurassic world is the landscape. By this point, Pangaea had begun to break apart in earnest. The northern portion, which would eventually become North America. Europe and Asia had started to separate from the southern portion, which would become South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, and India. These two great landmasses are called Laurasia in the north and Gondwana in the south. Between them, the Tethys Sea had expanded. New ocean floors were spreading. Shallow inland seas had begun to form as the continents rifted apart. This breakup of Pangaea had enormous consequences for life on Earth. As the continents separated, populations of animals and plants became isolated from one another and began to evolve independently. New climatic patterns emerged as ocean currents changed. The interior of what had once been Pangaea's vast, dry heartland became more accessible, some moisture from the new seas forming around it. The climate of the Jurassic was generally warm and humid, much more so than the Triassic had been. Rainforests spread. Ferns carpeted vast areas of ground. Conifer trees grew tall and dense. It was into this lush, warm world that the sauropod dinosaurs exploded in diversity and size. The sauropods were the long-necked, long-tailed, teeth, four-legged giants that have captured human imagination ever since their fossils were first discovered. They include some of the largest animals ever to walk the land. Creatures like Brachiosaurus, with its enormously long neck held upright like a giraffe's, browsing in the high canopy. Diplodocus, with its whip-like tail and horizontal necks sweeping low across the ground. Brontosaurus, massive and slow, its footsteps shaking the earth. How did these animals get so big? This is a question that scientists have studied for decades. Part of the answer lies in their digestive systems. Sauropods could not chew their food. They had simple peg-like teeth designed only to strip leaves from branches. They swallowed their food whole and relied on fermentation in enormous gut chambers to break it down. This meant they could process huge quantities of low-quality plant material very efficiently. They were essentially enormous walking fermentation vats. And in a world thick with vegetation, being a huge fermentation vat was a very successful strategy. Their enormous size also offered other advantages. Large bodies retain heat more easily, which was useful in a world where temperatures could vary. A very large body is also harder for predators to attack. And the long neck, whatever its precise function, and scientists still debate this, gave sauropods access to food sources that smaller animals could not reach. Whether they held their necks high or low, the extraordinary length of their necks gave them options that other plant eaters simply did not have. The predators of the Jurassic were equally impressive. Allosaurus was one of the dominant large carnivores of the late Jurassic, at least in what is now North America. It was a powerfully built animal, perhaps 10 to 12 meters long, with strong arms bearing three-fingered clawed hands, powerful legs, and a large skull filled with serrated teeth. It was not the largest predator that ever lived, but in its time and place, it was formidable. Evidence from fossil bones suggests that Allosaurus hunted in the same areas as the great sauropods. And some specimens show evidence of injuries inflicted by sauropod tails, the dangers of hunting animals many times your own size. The Jurassic also saw the appearance of one of the most significant creatures in the history of life, a small, feathered animal that bridges the gap between the dinosaurs and the birds. Archaeopteryx, discovered in the limestone beds of what is now Germany, lived about 150 million years ago. It had feathers, wings, and the general shape of a bird. But it also had teeth, a long bony tail, and clawed fingers on its wings, features inherited from its theropod dinosaur ancestors. Archaeopteryx is not the direct ancestor of modern birds, but it sits very close to the base of the bird family tree. And its discovery transformed our understanding of how birds evolved. In the oceans, the Jurassic seas were rich and complex. Dicynodonts reached their peak diversity and included some enormous species. A new group of marine reptiles, the plesiosaurs, had become major predators in the world's oceans. Plesiosaurs came in to main body plants, the long-necked forms, with small heads and barrel-shaped bodies supported by huge paddle-like limbs, and to short-necked, large-headed forms called plesiosaurians, which were among the most powerful predators that ever lived in the sea. Swimming through a Jurassic ocean would have meant sharing the water with creatures that make modern great white sharks look modest. By the end of the Jurassic, the world had been transformed from the relatively simple landscapes of the Triassic into something richer, more complex, more thoroughly colonized by life than anything that had existed before. The continents were continuing to drift. The climate was warm and stable. Life had diversified into an astonishing array of forms on land, in the air, and in the sea, and somewhere in the undergrowth, in the trees, and in the skies. A new experiment was quietly taking shape, one that would eventually produce a world more familiar to us than anything the Jurassic knew. The Cretaceous period began about 145 million years ago, and it is, in many ways, the most important of the three Mesozoic periods for understanding the world we live in today. It is during the Cretaceous that the continents took on shapes you might almost recognize. It is during the Cretaceous that the most famous dinosaurs lived, and it is during the Cretaceous that one of the most revolutionary events in the history of plant life transformed almost every ecosystem on Earth. Flowers appeared, and nothing was ever quite the same again. The world at the start of the Cretaceous was still warm and largely ice-free. Much like the Jurassic, sea levels were high, so high in fact that large portions of the continents were flooded by shallow inland seas. The Western Interior Seaway, for example, stretched across what is now the middle of North America from the Arctic Ocean all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, dividing the continent into two separate landmasses. Europe was largely an archipelago, a scattering of tropical islands in a warm sea. These shallow continental seas were enormously productive, teeming with life, and they left behind some of the richest fossil deposits in the world. The continents themselves were now clearly separate, though they were still not in the positions they occupy today. The South Atlantic Ocean was opening up as South America and Africa pulled apart. Though at the start of the Cretaceous, the gap was still relatively narrow, a sea rather than an ocean. Pangaea had broken away from Gondwana and was drifting northward, still millions of years from its collision with Asia that would eventually build the Himalayas. Australia and Antarctica were still joined together, a cold, forested landmass at the southern edge of the world. The appearance of flowering plants, the angiosperms, during the early Cretaceous was a revolution that reshaped life on Earth more profoundly than any single event since the development of photosynthesis. Flowering plants evolved a remarkable partnership with animals. The flower offered nectar, and in return, the animal carried pollen from plant to plant. The fruit offered food, and in return, the animal carried seeds to new locations. It was a deal that worked spectacularly well for both parties. Flowering plants began to diversify at breathtaking speed, eventually producing the vast majority of plant species alive today. The effect on animal life was equally profound. Insects, already highly diverse, exploded in diversity alongside the flowers. Bees, butterflies, and many other groups we recognize today evolved in close partnership with flowering plants. Small mammals, which had existed since the Triassic but had been largely confined to small, nocturnal niches, found new food sources in fruits and seeds. Even the dinosaurs adapted to exploit the new plant communities. The rise of the angiosperms was not just a botanical event. It was an ecological revolution that touched every corner of the world. The Cretaceous is also when the most famous of all dinosaurs lived. Tyrannosaurus rex, the animal that has probably captured more human imagination than any other creature in history, lived in the very last stage of the Cretaceous, roughly 68 to 66 million years ago. It was a massive bipedal predator, up to 13 meters long and perhaps 9 tons in weight. Its arms were tiny relative to its body, a feature that has puzzled and amused people for over a century. But its skull was enormous, bearing teeth the size and shape of bananas, and its bite force was among the greatest of any land animal that has ever lived. Tyrannosaurus was not, however, a solitary killing machine living in a simple world. It lived in a rich and complex ecosystem alongside an extraordinary variety of other animals. There were the horned ceratopsians, Triceratops, and his relatives, which were among the most numerous large plant eaters of the late Cretaceous. There were the armored ankylosaurs, cank-like animals encrusted with bony plates and carrying club-like tail weapons, capable of breaking the bones of even the largest predators. There were the hadrosaurs, the duck-billed dinosaurs, which formed vast herds and raised their young in colonies. This was not a simple two-creature drama of predator and prey. It was a full and complex world. The skies of the Cretaceous were filled with a remarkable diversity of pterosaurs, some of which had reached extraordinary sizes. Quetzalcoatlus, from the very end of the Cretaceous, is one of the largest flying animals ever known, with a wingspan of perhaps 10 to 12 meters. Standing on the ground, it would have been roughly as tall as a giraffe. It was not a bird. It was not a dinosaur. It was a pterosaur, a lineage of flying reptiles that had been airborne since the Triassic and had spent 150 million years mastering the air. Alongside the pterosaurs flew the birds, now diverse and well-established, descendants of the feathered theropod dinosaurs that had been evolving since at least the Jurassic. In the oceans, the Cretaceous seas were home to some of the most spectacular marine predators that have ever existed. The mosasaurs were enormous marine lizards, closely related to modern monitor lizards that had evolved into highly efficient ocean predators. Some grew to lengths of 15 or more meters. They had powerful, flexible bodies and jaws lined with conical teeth, and they occupied the top predator role in many of the world's oceans during the later Cretaceous. The plesiosaurs were still present, still diverse, still producing enormous forms that struck terror into anything sharing the water with them. By the final stages of the Cretaceous, around 70 to 66 million years ago, the world had been transformed into something rich, diverse, and extraordinary. The continents were approaching something like their modern configuration. The flora was dominated by flowering plants. The fauna was diverse beyond description. Dinosaurs and birds in the air and on the ground. Mosasaurs and plesiosaurs in the sea. Mammals in the undergrowth. Insects in their millions. It was a world at the height of its Mesozoic complexity. And then, in what was geologically speaking an eye blink, it ended. So far, we have looked at the broad sweep of the Mesozoic, the changing geography, the shifting climate, the great groups of animals that rose and fell. But what was it actually like to be alive in this world? What would you experience if you could somehow stand inside it, breathing its air, feeling its heat, watching its creatures move? So let us try, as best we can, to enter the Mesozoic and experience it from the inside. The first thing you would notice, stepping into a Jurassic or Cretaceous forest, would probably be the sound. Or rather, a particular absence of sound. There would be no birdsong, or rather, what birdsong existed would be thin and unfamiliar. Modern birds evolved their remarkable variety of calls and songs over tens of millions of years of evolution. The birds of the Mesozoic, close as they were to their dinosaurian ancestors, probably made simpler sounds, till we would be insects, the buzz and chirp of beetles and early flying insects, but not the full, symphonic insect chorus of a modern summer night. The soundscape of the Mesozoic would have been quieter than a modern forest, and stranger. The air would be noticeably different too, higher in carbon dioxide, warmer, perhaps slightly lower in oxygen than what we breathe. Whether you would feel this immediately is uncertain. Humans are adaptable creatures, but the plants growing in that air would certainly reflect it. The lush, dense vegetation of the Jurassic and Cretaceous was partly a product of those elevated carbon dioxide levels, which acted like a fertilizer for plant growth. The world was greener because it was warmer and richer in the gas that plants breathe. The sheer scale of the large dinosaurs is difficult to absorb from reading a description. But consider this: a large sauropod-like patacodaton, one of the most massive dinosaurs known from the Cretaceous of South America, may have weighed 70 tons or more. That is roughly the weight of 10 full-grown African elephants. An animal of that size walking would shake the ground perceptibly at a significant distance. Its footsteps would leave impressions that we still find as fossils today, great bowl-shaped depressions in ancient mud, sometimes filled with water, sometimes nested one inside the other where the animal had been standing. Standing beside such an animal would be a profoundly humbling experience. Yet these enormous animals were not the whole story. The Mesozoic world was also home to an extraordinary variety of small creatures. And in many ways, it is the small things that tell us most about what the world was really like. Small feathered dinosaurs, many of them covered in complex, colorful plumage, occupied the roles that small birds fill today, nesting in trees, hunting insects, eating seeds. Small mammals, most of them no larger than a modern mouse or rat, scurried through the undergrowth at night, foraging for insects and plant material while the big predators slept or rested. The Mesozoic was not just a world of giants. It was a world of layered complexity, with different creatures occupying different niches at different times of day. Recent discoveries have transformed our understanding of how dinosaurs actually looked and behaved. For most of the history of paleontology, dinosaurs were imagined as scaly, cold-blooded, slow-moving animals, essentially giant lizards. We now know this picture is almost entirely wrong. Most dinosaurs, especially the theropods, the two-legged meat-eaters, were covered, at least partly, in feathers. Color-producing structures preserved in fossil feathers have allowed scientists to determine that some dinosaurs had striking, complex coloration, iridescent blacks, rusty reds, bold patterns that suggest their appearance was important for communication, play, and mate attraction, just as plumage is important in modern birds. We also know now that dinosaurs were almost certainly warm-blooded, or close to it. Evidence from bone growth patterns, from their likely metabolism, and from their close relationship to modern birds and crocodilians all point in the same direction. Dinosaurs were not sluggish, cold-blooded reptiles waiting for the sun to warm them before they could move. They were active, energetic animals with high metabolic rates, capable of sustained activity. Cami were intelligent by reptile standards, perhaps by any standards in the case of the larger theropods. The image of the dinosaur as a lumbering, dim-witted beast is simply not accurate. The social lives of dinosaurs were more complex than we once imagined to. There was evidence from bone beds, places where large numbers of individuals of the same species died together, that some dinosaurs lived in groups or herds. Hadrosaurs, the duck-billed dinosaurs, appear to have been highly gregarious, living in large communities and showing evidence of parental care for their young. Some theropods may have hunted cooperatively. The crests and frills and elaborate horns of many dinosaurs suggest that visual communication and display were important aspects of their social lives, as they are for birds today. The plants of the Mesozoic deserve attention too, because they shaped every aspect of life in this world. The forests of the Jurassic were dominated by tall conifers, trees that would look broadly familiar, though the species were all different from anything alive today. Undergrowth of ferns and horsetails covered the ground. Cycads, squat, palm-like plants with thick trunks and crowns of stiff leaves were common in many environments. Then, as the Cretaceous progressed and flowering plants spread, the landscape changed. Forests began to look more varied. Ground cover diversified. Fruits and seeds appeared where only spores and cones had been before. The Cretaceous world, especially its later stages, was beginning to feel, at least in its plant life, something like a more ancient version of the world we know today. The day-to-day texture of Mesozoic life, the hunting, feeding, the nesting, the dying, the growing, was shaped by all of these elements together. A day in the late Cretaceous of North America might see Triceratops herds moving through open woodland, cropping low vegetation with their parrot-like beaks. A Tyrannosaurus might move through the same area at dusk, nose lowered to the ground, following a scent trail. Small feathered dinosaurs would rustle through the leaf litter, snapping up insects. A pterosaur would ride a thermal above the tree line, scanning the ground for carrion. And at night, as the big dinosaurs rested, the tiny mammals would emerge from their burrows, taking the world back for a few dark hours. Every story, no matter how long, eventually reaches its end. The Mesozoic Era came to a close 66 million years ago in one of the most dramatic and consequential events in the history of life on Earth. It was not a slow decline. It was not a gradual fading away. It was a catastrophe of staggering proportions arriving from space, and it changed the world in ways that persist to this very day. The evidence for what happened is clear and consistent across dozens of research teams and thousands of fossil sites worldwide. An asteroid or comet, probably an asteroid and probably around 10 to 15 kilometers in diameter, struck the Earth at what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. The impact site, known as the Chicxulub crater, is buried beneath the Gulf of Mexico and the surrounding region. It is enormous, nearly 200 kilometers across, and it represents the scar left by one of the most energetic events to occur on Earth in hundreds of millions of years. The immediate effects of the impact were catastrophic on a scale that challenges comprehension. The energy released was billions of times greater than the most powerful nuclear weapons ever built. Rock vaporized. A great plume of superheated debris shot into the atmosphere. Wildfires ignited across a wide region. Enormous tsunamis radiated outward from the impact site, devastating coastlines across the Americas, Europe, and beyond. The shockwave from the impact traveled through the Earth's crust, triggering earthquakes and volcanic eruptions on the far side of the planet. But as devastating as the immediate effects were, it was what happened next that proved most deadly for most species. The debris thrown into the atmosphere by the impact, along with soot from the global wildfires and sulfur dioxide from the vaporized rock, created a shroud that blocked sunlight on a global scale. Photosynthesis collapsed. Plants died. The food chains that depended on plants collapsed in turn. Temperatures plummeted. After the initial pulse of heat, the world entered what amounted to an impact winter, cold, dark, and barren in a way it had not been for hundreds of millions of years. The non-avian dinosaurs, all the dinosaurs that were not birds, did not survive this event. Neither did the pterosaurs. The mosasaurs and plesiosaurs disappeared from the oceans. Many groups of fish, marine invertebrates, and other sea creatures went extinct. The ammonites, those coiled-shelled mollusks that had swum the world's oceans for hundreds of millions of years and serve as key markers for geologists dating ancient rock, disappeared entirely. Perhaps 3/4 of all species on Earth went extinct in what geologists call the KPG boundary event, the end Cretaceous mass extinction. And yet, life survived. It always does, because as long as any life survives at all, evolution has something to work with. The creatures that made it through the end Cretaceous extinction were, generally speaking, smaller, more adaptable, and better able to find food in a disrupted world. Freshwater animals did relatively well, because freshwater food chains are somewhat buffered from the collapse of photosynthesis. They are partly fueled by organic material washed in from the land. Crocodilians survived, as they had survived so much before. Turtles survived. Lizards and snakes survived. Frogs and salamanders made it through, and the birds survived. The feathered descendants of the theropod dinosaurs, which had been diversifying through the Cretaceous, mostly made it through the extinction event. They were small. They could eat seeds, which can remain viable in the soil, even when plants have died, and they were adaptable. In the aftermath of the extinction, they would diversify explosively into the wide variety of forms we see today. When you watch a bird fly, you are watching a living dinosaur. It's the only lineage of that extraordinary group to survive into the modern world. The mammals also survived, and for them, the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs was the opportunity of a lifetime. For the entirety of the Mesozoic mammals had been small, mostly nocturnal, largely confined to roles that the dominant dinosaurs had not claimed. The moment the dinosaurs were gone, those constraints vanished. In the Paleogene period that followed, mammals diversified with astonishing speed, evolving into the enormous variety of forms, from bats to whales, from horses to elephants, from shrews to primates that would come to dominate the land. And among those primates, tens of millions of years after the asteroid struck, a lineage of upright apes emerged from the forests of Africa. They had large brains and quick hands and a remarkable capacity for learning and communication. They began to spread across the world, to modify their environments, to tell stories about the past and plan for the future. In time, they developed the tools to dig up fossils, to analyze ancient rock, to piece together the history of a world that had vanished long before any human eye had opened. They found the bones of the giants. They reconstructed the ancient seas. They looked back across 252 million years of history and tried, as best they could, to understand. That story, the Mesozoic story, is one of the most extraordinary in the history of this planet. It is a story of catastrophe and recovery, of evolution and extinction, of creatures so different from anything alive today that they seem to belong to another world entirely. In a sense, they do. The Earth of the Mesozoic was a different planet, hotter, stranger, populated by animals and plants that have no living counterparts. Yet, it is also our planet, the same rock, the same ocean, the same sun, and the life that existed then is the ancestor of the life that exists now. Every bird that sings outside your window carries the inheritance of the age of dinosaurs. Every flower that opens in spring is a descendant of the plants that fed the last great herds of the Cretaceous. The Mesozoic is not gone. It is woven into everything alive today. We stand at an extraordinary vantage point, able to look back across deep time and glimpse a world that no human being has ever seen, but that science has allowed us to understand. The story of the Mesozoic is the story of life at its most ambitious, most creative, and most vulnerable. It is a reminder that the world can be very different from what we know, and that even the mightiest empires of life eventually give way to whatever comes next. It is a story without a clean ending, because the ending, the world we live in now, is still being written. And perhaps that is the most important thing to understand. The Mesozoic is over, but its consequences surround us every single day.